Welcome to this special Christmas Day episode of the Balancing Act podcast. As we celebrate this holiday season with family and friends, I've been reflecting on the gift of knowledge, the kind that empowers us to make better decisions and build more secure futures. Financial literacy is one of those enduring gifts that we can give ourselves, and that's why I'm excited to introduce you to my other show, Money Lessons, with me, Andrew Temte. Money Lessons shares the same mission as the Balancing Act, supporting your journey of continuous improvement and lifelong learning. But instead of leadership conversations, Money Lessons transforms complex economic concepts into accessible, engaging stories. Each bite-sized episode builds on your financial knowledge through historical narratives that connect directly to your personal financial decisions today. Whether you're navigating your career, building wealth, or planning for retirement, understanding how money and the economy works is essential to your success. So, here's last week's episode of Money Lessons, the implications of government debt default. Merry Christmas, a belated Happy Hanukkah, or Happy Kwanzaa to you and yours. Hi, I'm Andy Temte, and welcome to Money Lessons. Join me every Saturday morning for bite-sized lessons that are designed to improve financial literacy around the world. Today is December the 20th, 2025. Last week, we discovered how England built credible institutions after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, transforming government borrowing from personal promises into institutional commitments backed by English Parliament. While the Bank of England initially borrowed at 8% in 1694, Britain's institutional credibility eventually allowed it to borrow at lower rates than its rivals, rates that dropped to 4 to 5% by the early 1700s, while France struggled with higher borrowing costs driven by chronic default risk. But here's the uncomfortable truth about sovereign debt. Governments can always choose not to pay. Today, we're exploring what happens when those promises break and why broken promises can haunt nations for generations. So, picture Paris in August of 1797. France has endured 8 years of upheaval. Revolution overthrew the monarchy. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed. The Reign of Terror claimed thousands of lives. And now the new government, the Directory, struggles to maintain order. But revolutionary fervor cannot solve mathematics, and France's finances are in a catastrophic state. The revolutionary government inherited massive debts from the old regime, wars, royal extravagance, and the very financial crisis that sparked the revolution. Then the revolution added its own expenses, fighting European coalitions, suppressing internal rebellions, and managing through economic chaos. The Directory faced an impossible choice: honor debts and bankrupt the treasury, or break promises and destroy credibility. On September the 30th, 1797, they chose the latter. The government declared what became known as the two-thirds bankruptcy. Here's what this meant. If you held 300 francs worth of French government bonds, the government announced that 200 francs, or two-thirds of that amount, were now worthless. Only 100 francs would be honored, and even that would be paid in new bonds of questionable value. The market's reaction was immediate and devastating. The new bonds quickly traded at just 6% of their face value. If you held one of those remaining 100-franc bonds, you could only sell it for about 6 francs. Bondholders lost over 90% of their investment overnight. Thousands of French families, small merchants, professionals, widows living on bond income, they were financially destroyed. France had chosen immediate fiscal relief over long-term credibility. France wasn't the first to learn this painful lesson. Spain provides an even more dramatic example of how defaults create vicious cycles. Remember the Fugger family from last week? Jacob Fugger led a consortium that raised 850,000 florins, with the Fuggers providing about 543,000 florins themselves to secure Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. That massive loan was part of a pattern that would haunt Spain for over a century. Spain defaulted on its debts in 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. 7 major defaults in 90 years. Each time, Spain negotiated terms promising this time would be different. Each time, Spain defaulted again. Why did creditors keep lending? Well, Spain controlled vast American silver mines, and creditors hoped each new government would finally establish some sort of fiscal discipline. But, as we know, hope is not a management strategy, and Spain's serial defaults made borrowing progressively more expensive and difficult. By the mid-1600s, Spain, despite controlling much of Europe and the Americas, could barely borrow at any price. The golden age of Spanish power ended not through military defeat, but through financial exhaustion caused by destroyed credibility. Now, understanding why sovereign nations break promises reveals something fundamental about government debt. Private borrowers who default face clear consequences. Creditors can seize collateral, force bankruptcy, and prevent future borrowing. But you can't foreclose on France or Spain. Sovereign default is fundamentally different from private default. Now, governments typically default for several reasons. First, wars exhaust treasuries faster than tax revenue can replenish them. France's revolution and subsequent wars created expenses that no realistic tax system could finance. Second, political revolution breaks continuity. New governments often refuse to honor previous regimes' quote-unquote illegitimate debts, as revolutionary France did. And finally, fiscal mismanagement creates unsustainable debt burdens. Spain's repeated defaults showed that even vast silver wealth couldn't overcome chronic overspending. Now, just FYI, we're living a version of this in the United States today. Our national debt is 120% of gross domestic product, and we should all be very concerned. Now, what are the consequences? Default provides immediate relief, but imposes severe long-term costs. In the short term, it solves whatever cash flow crisis is happening. France reduced its debt burden by 2/3 overnight. Spain repeatedly escaped crushing interest payments. But in the long term, the costs compound. Loss of credibility makes future borrowing expensive or impossible. France struggled to borrow for decades after 1797. Economic isolation follows as creditors refuse new lending, hampering growth precisely when nations need it the most. Domestic investment flees, and why would French citizens reinvest after losing 90% of their money? Capital fled to more stable nations like England. Political instability worsens as citizens who lost savings blame the government, creating pressure that can topple regimes. Now, these patterns haven't disappeared. Greece's 2010 to 2015 financial crisis was essentially a slow-motion default, with creditors eventually accepting that Greece couldn't repay its debts in full. The consequences matched historical patterns: economic contraction, political turmoil, and years of expensive borrowing. The lesson remains consistent. Default is always an option for sovereign governments, but choosing it starts a cycle that's difficult to escape. So here's what makes sovereign default so insidious. It destroys the credibility that's essential for successful government borrowing. England's constitutional monarchy after 1688 created this credible commitment. The government couldn't default without Parliament's consent, and Parliament represented creditors for the most part. France lacked these institutions. The revolutionary government could default by decree, and so it did. Spain's absolute monarchy could default whenever immediate needs overwhelmed long-term thinking. Once destroyed, rebuilding credibility requires decades. Spain needed a century to recover, and France's creditworthiness remained damaged throughout the Napoleonic era. Next week, we're going to see how private corporations learned from these sovereign debt lessons. Unlike governments, corporations face bankruptcy courts and legal consequences for breaking promises. This difference shaped how corporate bond markets developed and why they required different protections for investors. The fundamental insight remains: all debt is a promise, and breaking promises, even when legally possible, carries costs that compound across generations. Until next week, I wish you grace, dignity, and compassion. My name is Andy Temte. This is Money Lessons. You can find the show on all the major streaming services as well as out on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, rate, and most importantly, share this public good with your friends, your family, a neighbor, and maybe a colleague. The show is produced by Nicholas Temte. We'll see you next time on Money Lessons.